You can buy an animal that looks completely harmless. Take it home, and never realize that in another part of America, simply keeping that same pet could put you on the wrong side of the law. And we're not talking about tigers or venomous snakes. We're talking about animals sold as pets every day. Some are tiny, some are incredibly cute, and at least one looks like the kind of pet almost nobody would ever think to question. Welcome back to Wild Unknown. Today, we're counting down 5 surprisingly common pets that could be illegal where you live. And number 1, you may have never even thought of it as an exotic animal. A hedgehog looks like the last animal that should cause legal trouble. It's tiny, quiet, and when something scares it, its greatest defense is basically turning itself into a spiky ball. Yet in places like California, keeping one as an ordinary pet isn't allowed, and the reason has almost nothing to do with the hedgehog being dangerous to you. The real concern begins with what could happen if one escapes. Hedgehogs are non-native animals, and wildlife officials worry that released pets could survive, reproduce, compete with native species, or introduce problems into ecosystems that never evolved with them. There's another issue hiding beneath those adorable faces. Hedgehogs can carry salmonella even when they appear perfectly healthy. The bacteria can spread through their droppings and contaminate their bodies, bedding, cages, and the hands of people who handle them. So the strange thing about a hedgehog isn't that it's secretly some terrifying animal. It's almost the opposite. It looks so harmless that most people would never think to check the law before bringing one home. You could see one online, fall in love with it, find a breeder, and only afterward discover that where you live changes everything. But if banning a hedgehog seems strange, the next pet makes even less sense at first. Because people don't just buy this animal to keep in a cage, they buy it because they want it to bond with them. A sugar glider almost seems designed to become an internet-famous pet. Huge dark eyes, tiny paws, and a membrane of skin that allows it to glide through the air. They're often shown riding on shoulders, hiding inside pockets, or curling up against their owners. But in places such as California, you can't simply bring one home as an ordinary pet. And once again, the animal itself isn't the obvious danger. Part of the concern is what happens when a non-native species escapes into an environment where it doesn't belong. But with sugar gliders, there's another side to the story. Sometimes the biggest problem isn't what the pet could do to us. It's what we can do to the pet. Sugar gliders are wild, highly social marsupials. They weren't designed to spend their lives alone in a small cage. They need companionship, space, stimulation, and a specialized diet. And because they're nocturnal, their idea of the perfect time to become active may begin just when you're getting ready to sleep. That's the part cute videos don't always show. A tiny animal riding inside someone's shirt can look incredibly easy to own. But behind those enormous eyes is an animal with needs far more complicated than its size suggests. And that's what makes exotic pets so deceptive. Sometimes the smaller and cuter they look, the easier it is to forget that they were never designed for our living rooms. But number 3 is different. It doesn't look exotic. It doesn't even look wild. In fact, millions of people would probably describe it as one of the most ordinary starter pets imaginable, and that's exactly why its place on this list is so surprising. A gerbil may be the most innocent-looking animal in this entire countdown. For generations, these tiny rodents have been sold as beginner pets. They live in glass tanks, run on wheels, dig through bedding. Nothing about them screams illegal animal. But in California, ordinary pet gerbils are prohibited, and the reason isn't because they're aggressive. It's because California may be a little too much like home. Gerbils are adapted to dry environments, and wildlife officials are concerned that escaped animals could survive, reproduce, and potentially establish populations in areas with suitable conditions. That changes the way you look at such a tiny pet. One escaped gerbil doesn't seem frightening, But wildlife laws aren't written around what one animal can do today. They're often written around what hundreds or thousands of their descendants could potentially do later. And rodents have one ability regulators take very seriously. They reproduce quickly. If a non-native population becomes established, removing it can be far more difficult than preventing it from arriving in the first place. So in most American homes, a gerbil is simply a small pet digging through its bedding. Cross into the wrong state, and suddenly the exact same animal becomes something regulators don't want released into the environment. But number 2 makes this story even stranger. Because unlike the gerbil, this next animal isn't merely something people think of as a pet. Humans have been living and working with it for centuries. And yet in one of America's largest states, bringing one home can still put you on the wrong side of the law. A ferret doesn't feel like an exotic pet. That's what makes this one so strange. Humans have kept ferrets for centuries. Today they sleep in hammocks, race through tunnels, steal objects they absolutely don't need, and live in homes much like cats or other small companion animals. Across most of the United States, that's perfectly legal. But in California, keeping a ferret as an ordinary household pet is prohibited. And unlike the gerbil before it, this ban has been controversial for years. The concern is what could happen if domestic ferrets escaped or were released. Wildlife authorities have argued that they could threaten native animals, particularly small mammals, reptiles, and ground-nesting birds. Ferret supporters see things differently. They argue that modern domestic ferrets have depended on humans for generations and are poorly equipped to establish the kind of wild populations regulators fear. And that's what makes this case fascinating. This isn't simply a story about an animal. It's a story about how differently people can interpret risk. To one side, preventing a possible ecological problem before it begins makes perfect sense. To the other, banning a domesticated companion animal because of something it might do feels impossible to justify. Meanwhile, the ferret has no idea any of this debate exists. It's still the same curious little animal, whether it's sleeping legally in one state or prohibited as an ordinary pet across the border. But there's still one animal left, and number 1 is where this countdown gets especially difficult to believe. Because you don't need to visit an exotic animal breeder to recognize it. You don't need to know anything about unusual pets. You've probably seen animals like it countless times, and depending on exactly what it is and where you live, the rules can become surprisingly complicated. A hamster may be the last animal you'd expect to finish this list. Not a wild predator, not an exotic marsupial, just a tiny animal running on a wheel in a cage. For millions of people, it practically defines the idea of a beginner pet. But take that same animal to Hawaii, and the story changes completely. Hawaii officially prohibits hamsters from entry or possession by private individuals. And the reason isn't that anyone is afraid of a hamster. It's because Hawaii has something the mainland doesn't: an extraordinarily isolated ecosystem. For islands, introducing the wrong animal can create consequences that last for generations. A pet escapes, it survives, more escape or are released. And if the environment allows them to reproduce, yesterday's harmless pet can become tomorrow's invasive species. Hawaii has already learned how difficult introduced animals can be to control, which is why the state maintains strict rules around many non-native species. Its prohibited list doesn't stop with hamsters. It also includes animals such as gerbils, ferrets, and even certain familiar reptiles and birds. And that's what makes the hamster the perfect number 1. Because nothing about it feels illegal. You can see hamsters in pet stores. Children keep them as first pets. Entire corners of the internet are dedicated to elaborate hamster cages, tunnels, and tiny obstacle courses. Yet move that cage to the wrong place, and the law sees something completely different. Not a cute little pet. A biological risk that should never have arrived. And maybe that's the strangest lesson behind every animal on this list. The law isn't always asking, is this animal dangerous? Sometimes it's asking a much bigger question. What could happen if this animal gets out? So the strangest thing about these pets isn't that they're secretly dangerous. Most aren't. The real surprise is how much location changes the rules. A hedgehog in one home may be perfectly ordinary. A ferret across a state line can become prohibited. And even something as familiar as a hamster can face restrictions in a place where protecting a fragile ecosystem comes first. So before bringing home an unusual pet, there's one question worth asking before anything else. Is it actually legal where you live? Tell us in the comments, which animal on this list surprised you the most? And subscribe to Wild Unknown for more stories hiding behind animals we think we already understand. Because sometimes, the most surprising thing about an animal isn't what it can do. It's where you're allowed to keep it.